Priya Desai had a way of going still when something on her screen didn't match something in her head. I didn't know that about her yet. I only knew that she'd asked me to sit down, and that she hadn't smiled since I walked in, and that she kept scrolling back up to the same date range like it might change if she looked at it again.
Mrs. Calloway. She turned the monitor slightly. Not enough for me to read it, just enough to remind me it existed. These transfers. Same amount, same day, every month for 2 years. I remember thinking, 2 years is a strange amount of time to say out loud. 2 years is long enough that you stop noticing a thing is missing. Long enough that the missing becomes the normal. She didn't finish the sentence. A phone rang somewhere behind the partition, and a man in a golf shirt asked to tell her a question about overdraft fees. And for a second, the whole credit union just kept running, like nothing in my life had changed in the last 90 seconds.
3 weeks before that morning, I didn't know any of this. I want to start there, because that's where I actually was, before I understood that the 2 years Priya Desai was staring at weren't really about the money. They were about how long I'd let someone else decide what counted as protecting me.
My name is Nora Calloway. I'm 36. For 10 years, I served in Army counterintelligence, most of that time at Fort Merrow, Georgia, doing work I still don't talk about in detail, not because it's some dramatic secret, but because the job itself was mostly patience. You learn to notice when a story doesn't add up, a timeline with a half-second delay in it, a signature that's a little too careful, a person who answers a question before you finish asking it.
I was good at it. Good enough that when a supply convoy I was screening got hit outside a checkpoint 2.5 years ago, and the vehicle in front of mine caught fire, it was my own dog who got me out before I could get myself out. Duke. Belgian Malinois. 40 pounds of muscle and stubbornness. Trained to find explosives, and apparently also trained, in some way nobody put on a certification, to grab a woman's sleeve in his teeth and drag her 12 feet across gravel while her leg wasn't working right. I don't remember most of that day clearly. I remember Duke's weight against my hip. I remember the sound changing before I understood why. I was medically retired 8 months later. Nerve damage, 2 surgeries, a limp that shows up when I'm tired, and a monthly disability payment from the VA. That is, on paper, compensation for what that day cost me. I don't love that word, compensation. It makes it sound like a fair trade. Alan and I had been married 3 years when it happened. He was steady through the worst of it. I want to say that clearly, because it's true, and because it matters for what came later. He drove me to appointments. He learned how to change the dressing on my leg without flinching. When the surgeon told us that stress could slow the nerve regeneration, that I needed to stay calm and let my body do its work, Alan took that instruction more seriously than anyone. He took over the bills, the accounts, the forms. He kept every form from that first month in a folder of his own. My hospital paperwork, the liability waivers, the discharge papers, all of it, because for a while, I couldn't be trusted to hold a pen steady enough to sign my own name. "You don't need to think about any of this," he said. "Let me carry it for a while." I let him. I remember one night about 4 months into my recovery, maybe 2 in the morning, when the nerve pain in my leg was bad enough that I couldn't find a position that didn't hurt. Alan got up without being asked, heated a rice sock in the microwave, and sat on the floor next to the bed for over an hour, just talking, not about anything important, just describing in absurd detail a fishing trip he'd taken with his father as a kid, because he'd noticed that the sound of his voice, more than the words in it, was the thing that let me relax enough to sleep. I loved him for that specifically for a long time. It's part of why none of what came later made sense to me at first. People don't usually hold both of those things at once. The man on the floor with the rice sock, and the man who would later tell me to let my dog die, rather than touch the money he'd already spent. But they can. That's the part nobody warns you about. That's the part I've had to sit with since. Not that he offered to help, that I let a temporary kindness become a permanent transfer of everything I used to watch closely. A while turned into 2 years, without either of us ever deciding it should. Here is what people believed about me by then. Alan's mother thought I was fragile. His business partner, Marcus, thought I was the quiet ex-army wife who didn't say much at dinner parties. Nobody in that circle knew I still did fraud pattern review 3 days a week for an insurance company, the same instincts I'd stopped using at home.
There's a particular loneliness in being underestimated by the one person who's supposed to know you best. I'd stopped calling it loneliness. I just called it married life.
Alan ran a logistics consulting firm, Meridian, with Marcus Feld. The two of them had built it from a spare bedroom into an actual office, with an actual staff of 6. Alan liked to describe it as still finding its legs, which I now understand was a phrase he'd been using for longer than I realized.
We had one thing that was purely uncomplicatedly good, and that was Duke. He'd been medically retired around the same time I was. Too many joint injuries from the blast to keep working. And after a year of paperwork, I'd adopted him myself. He slept at the foot of our bed. He still flinched at fireworks and didn't flinch at gunfire on television, which the vet said was normal, and which I understood perfectly.
Duke was 7 years old. He'd started slowing down that spring. Nothing dramatic, just a stiffness in the mornings, a little more sleep than usual. I told myself it was age. I was wrong about that too, though not in the way I expected.
A few weeks before any of this started, I'd asked Alan, half distracted, folding laundry, whether we were still on track for the vacation we'd talked about that fall. He'd said something vague about waiting to see how a few things shake out at work, and I'd let it go, the way you let go of 100 small deflections a year, without ever adding them up into a pattern. I think about that laundry folding version of myself sometimes. She had every piece of information she needed to ask a real question. She just hadn't learned yet that she was allowed to.
It was a Tuesday night, close to 11, when Duke wouldn't get up. He'd been fine at dinner. Then I heard him retch in the hallway, and by the time I got to him, his gums had gone pale, and his breathing had that fast, shallow rhythm I recognized from another context entirely. The rhythm of something going wrong inside a body faster than the body can compensate for it. I got him into the car myself. My leg didn't like the lifting, but I didn't think about that until later.
The emergency vet clinic was 20 minutes away, fluorescent lit at midnight, smelling like antiseptic and wet dog. Dr. Patel met us at the desk before I'd finished parking the thought in my head that this was serious. She was maybe 40, unhurried in the way of someone who has learned that panicking a client wastes time. 2 techs already had a gurney rolling towards us before Dr. Patel finished introducing herself. And Duke, who never lets anyone but me touch his hind end without a fight, went limp against the vinyl without protest, which frightened me more than anything he could have done.
Working dog? Dr. Patel asked, watching him.
Military, retired. That tracks. She ran her hands along Duke's abdomen, and her face changed for half a second, the way a professional's face changes when they already know something and are deciding how to say it.
His spleen, she said. I need to get imaging, but I think we're looking at a mass that's bleeding internally. If that's what this is, he needs surgery tonight, not tomorrow.
Do it, I said. I want to be honest about the cost before you commit, because it's significant. Emergency splenectomy, overnight monitoring, likely a transfusion. You're looking at somewhere around $9,400, possibly more depending on what we find. I didn't flinch at the number. I flinched at the fact that I had no idea, standing in that hallway, whether we had it. I called Alan from the parking lot. It rang 4 times before he picked up, his voice thick with sleep. It's Duke, I said. He needs emergency surgery tonight. It's going to run around $9,000.
There was a pause that went on a beat too long.
Nora, it's 11 at night.
I'm aware of the time, Alan. I need you to authorize a transfer from savings, or tell me the account number so I can do it myself. I don't have the login memorized.
Another pause. I could hear him sitting up, the particular creak of our headboard.
How bad is bad?
They think his spleen's bleeding. He could die tonight without surgery.
Nora. He said my name the way you'd say it to someone standing too close to a ledge. He's 7. Dogs like that, working dogs, dogs with his history, they don't usually come back great from something like this. Even if the surgery works, you're looking at another surgery down the road. More vet bills. A dog who's never really the same.
That's not what I asked you.
I'm getting to it. I think the responsible thing here, the thing that actually helps him, not just helps us feel better, might be to let him go peacefully tonight, instead of putting him through $9,000 of surgery for a few more hard years.
I stood in that parking lot with the phone against my ear and felt something in my chest go very quiet, the way a room goes quiet right before you understand you're the last one in it.
You're telling me to put him down instead of paying for surgery.
I'm telling you it's an option worth considering. I'm not trying to be cold about it.
He pulled me out of a burning vehicle, Alan. I know what he did. I'm not disputing what he did. I'm telling you what $9,000 does to us right now, tonight, with everything else going on.
That was the first time in 2 years he'd said out loud that there was an everything else. I filed it. I didn't have room to unpack it yet. Dr. Patel was standing at the automatic doors, watching me through the glass with the particular patience of someone who has had this exact conversation with other people on other nights about other dogs.
I'm not letting him die in a parking lot argument, I said, and hung up.
I didn't go back inside right away. I sat in the car for maybe 90 seconds with my hands on the wheel, doing the thing I used to do before a briefing when the room was about to get difficult. Breathe out longer than I breathe in. Let the body catch up to the decision the mind has already made. Then I did something I hadn't done in 2 years. I called a number I still had memorized, one I'd never expected to use.
My grandfather, Walter Voss, died when I was 26, but before that, the summer I turned 19, the summer before I left for basic training, he sat me down at his kitchen table with a lawyer I'd never met and told me he was setting something aside for me. I remember the lawyer's briefcase more clearly than I remember most of that summer, a scuffed brown thing he set on my grandfather's checkered tablecloth like it belonged there. "Not for your parents," my grandfather said. "Not for a husband, if you get one. For you, specifically, in case you're ever the only person standing between yourself and a bad decision made by someone else." He'd laughed when he said it, tapping the table twice like he was closing a deal with himself. "You've always been the one who checks the math twice, Nora girl. This is just so you've got something to check it with."
I thought it was sentimental at the time, the kind of thing a grandfather says to make a granddaughter feel important the summer before she does something that terrifies him. The Voss Family Trust held a modest but real reserve fund, structured so that I was the sole trustee, invisible to any joint account, untouched by anything that happened in my marriage. Part of it had gone years later toward the down payment on the house Alan and I bought together, on the condition my grandfather's lawyer had insisted that the trust stay attached to the deed no matter whose names ended up on the mortgage. I hadn't accessed it in 17 years. I'd almost forgotten the account number existed, outside of a folder in a fireproof box at the back of my closet, filed under a manila tab that just said, in my grandfather's blocky handwriting, "In case." I called the trust's administrator from the vet clinic parking lot at 11:40 at night, gave my identifying information, and authorized an emergency transfer of $9,400 to cover Duke's surgery. It took 11 minutes. Dr. Patel had him in the operating room before midnight. I didn't tell Alan where the money came from. I let him believe, for the next several days, that I'd simply figured it out, the same phrase he liked to use about other people's problems. I sat in the clinic waiting room until 4 in the morning, in a plastic chair bolted to the floor, next to a family whose cat had gotten into something under their kitchen sink. Somewhere around 2, I stopped thinking about Duke's spleen, and started thinking about the sentence Alan had used on the phone. Everything else going on. He'd said it the way you say something you've said to yourself so many times it's worn a groove. Automatic, unguarded, the kind of phrase that slips out of a person only after months of private rehearsal. I kept turning it over in that plastic chair, the same way I used to turn over a suspicious phrase in an interview transcript, looking for the seam where the true thing had been sewn into the cover story. Everything else going on. Not, "This month's been tight." Not, "We've had some setbacks." Everything else. A phrase that assumes the listener already knows what it's referring to, spoken to a wife who very clearly did not.
I'm trained to notice when someone says more than they meant to. I just hadn't been using that training on my own house. Duke came through the surgery. Dr. Patel called it about as clean as this kind of thing gets, which in her voice sounded like real relief, not just professional courtesy. He'd be home in 2 days, on restricted movement for a month, and, barring complications, expected to have a normal life expectancy for a dog his size and history. I sat with that news the way you sit with news you weren't sure you'd get. The night after he came home, once he was asleep in his crate with a cone he hated and a heating pad under his blanket, I sat down at the kitchen table with my laptop and did something I hadn't done in 2 years.
I logged into our joint accounts.
It took 3 tries to remember the password, which told me something about how thoroughly I'd stepped back from this part of my own life. Once I was in, I did what I used to do professionally. I didn't look for the big red flag first. I looked for the pattern. A repeated small transaction is more honest than a single large one, because nobody bothers disguising something they only do once.
It took 40 minutes to find it. A recurring transfer, $1,140, going out of our joint checking account on the 3rd of every month, the same day my VA disability deposit landed, into an account listed under Meridian Consulting LLC, coded in Alan's bookkeeping software as Family Expense Reimbursement.
$1,140 every month for 24 months. I did the math on a legal pad, the way I used to do math when a number needed to survive being questioned later. $27,360. Almost exactly the value of 2 years of my disability payments, routed 1 month at a time into the company Alan had told me on more than one occasion was barely staying afloat. I didn't confront him that night. In my old job, the version of me who moved too fast on partial information was the version who got someone hurt. I closed the laptop a little before 1 in the morning and sat in the dark kitchen with Duke's slow breathing coming from the crate in the corner, and I let myself feel exactly one thing before I put it away. This had a shape. It had a start date. Somebody had built it on purpose. I called Denise the next afternoon from the parking lot of the pharmacy where I'd gone to refill Duke's pain medication. Denise Ruiz had been a supply sergeant at Fort Merrow for 6 years before I met her, and we'd stayed close, the way people stay close after they've watched each other be competent under pressure. A friendship built on trust rather than proximity, since she'd moved to Charlotte 2 years back, and we mostly talked on the phone now.
"You've got your quiet voice on," she said, before I'd said much of anything. "The one you used to use before a bad debrief."
I told her about the transfer pattern. Not all of it. I hadn't told anyone all of it yet, not even myself fully. Just the shape of it. $27,000, 2 years. A dog who almost died because her husband wanted to see if she'd notice. Denise didn't say anything for a moment, and I could hear a grocery cart rattling somewhere on her end. Ordinary sounds from an ordinary afternoon that wasn't happening to her.
"You know what you'd have told me to do," she finally said, "if I called you at this instead of the other way around."
"I know what I'd have told you."
Say it anyway. Sometimes you have to hear yourself say the thing before you'll do it.
Don't confront it until I've confirmed it independently. Don't tip my hand before I have leverage. Protect what's mine before I protect what's fair. I said it the way I used to recite standard operating procedure, flat and automatic, and only heard how strange it sounded, applying tradecraft to my own marriage after the words were already out of my mouth.
"There it is," Denise said. "You already know what to do, Nora. You've known for about 10 years. You just haven't given yourself permission to use it on somebody you love."
That sentence sat with me longer than almost anything else that week. I didn't cry in the pharmacy parking lot, but I sat in the car for a while after we hung up, watching an older man load a case of water into his trunk, and I thought about how much of the last 2 years I'd spent being careful not to seem too capable in my own house.
The next morning, Alan's phone would not stop ringing.
He took the first 2 calls in the bathroom with the door shut. By the third, he'd stopped bothering to hide, standing in the kitchen in yesterday's shirt, saying words like extension and "I understand, bud," in the tone of a man negotiating with someone who has already stopped listening.
When he hung up, his hands were doing something I'd never seen them do before, a small, repetitive motion against the counter, like he was trying to smooth something that wouldn't stay flat. I made coffee I didn't want, mostly to have something to do with my own hands, and watched him in the reflection of the microwave door instead of watching him directly, an old habit I hadn't realized I'd kept.
"Meridian's accounts are frozen," he said, before I'd asked. "A creditor filed something. I don't have the details yet. My lawyer's calling back."
"What creditor?"
"It doesn't matter right now." He looked at me the way you looked at a door you're hoping is unlocked. "Nora, I need you to do something for me today, and I need you to not ask a lot of questions about it first."
"How much does the creditor say you owe?"
"That's not
can you just, for once, not turn this into an interrogation? I have maybe 6 hours to fix this before it becomes a real problem, and I need my wife right now, not a debrief.
I am your wife, I said. That's exactly who's asking. And I don't stop asking questions just because someone's in a hurry. You know that about me.
Alan exhaled, the fight going out of him for a second. I know. Fine. He rubbed his eyes. We need to take out a home equity line against the house. Today, if we can. It's the fastest way to get enough capital in front of the creditor to keep this from becoming a bigger problem than it already is.
How much capital?
$85,000.
I kept my face the way I keep it in a room where someone is about to say something they think I don't already suspect. Against our house.
Our house, yes. It's just a line of credit, Nora. It's not like we're selling it. It's a formality. I've already got a notary lined up for this afternoon.
You've already lined up a notary. I wanted to move fast. You know how this business works. You lose a window, you lose everything. He reached for my hand, which he hadn't done in longer than either of us would have admitted. This is the thing I need. This is the actual emergency. I know you're still upset about the dog situation, and I know that came out wrong, but this is different. This is our house. This is our life. I let him keep talking, not because I agreed with anything he was saying, but because a man in a hurry tells you more than a man who's had time to prepare a story. And Alan, standing in our kitchen at 8 in the morning with unbrushed hair and a notary already booked, was very much a man in a hurry. Whose account does the line of credit deposit into? I asked, once it clears.
Meridian's operating account, obviously.
The same account that gets a transfer from our checking every month.
He stopped rubbing the counter.
What?
$1,140 on the 3rd of every month, coded as family expense reimbursement. Same day my disability payment lands. I watched his face do several things very quickly, and none of them were confusion. I found it last night.
Nora, that's not what it looks like. I haven't told you what it looks like to me yet.
He didn't have an answer for that. For a few seconds, the kitchen was quiet enough that I could hear Duke shifting in his crate down the hall, the soft clink of his cone against the plastic.
I'll explain everything, Alan finally said. I will. But right now, today, I need you to sign the HELOC paperwork. We can talk about the rest of it after. If we don't move today, none of the rest of it matters because we lose the house along with the company.
I told him I needed a few hours to think. He didn't like that answer, but he didn't have a version of the conversation left where he could push harder without saying something he wasn't ready to say yet. I watched him leave for the office a little after 9, still in yesterday's shirt, moving like a man who believed the hardest part was already behind him.
There was a storage unit receipt in the pocket of Alan's jacket. I found it while I was hanging the jacket back in the closet, not looking for anything, just doing the ordinary work of a morning. A monthly charge, $68, a facility across town I didn't recognize.
I asked him about it that evening, careful to keep my voice at the register of a woman asking an ordinary question.
Inventory, he said, barely looking up from his phone. Overflow stock from a client project. Marcus and I split a few units around town. It's cheaper than warehouse space downtown. It was a plausible answer, delivered without hesitation, which was itself worth noting. The rehearsed answers always come out smoother than the true ones, because the liar has had time alone with them, turning them over, filing off the rough edges. Businesses like Meridian did keep physical inventory sometimes, pallets and equipment and sample shipments waiting on client sign-off. I let it sit at plausible, filed next to the transfer pattern, and didn't push. Not yet. The instinct I'd spent 10 years training told me the same thing it always had. Don't confront a partial picture. Confirm it first, or you hand the other side time to build a better story than the true one.
I watched him for the rest of that evening the way I used to watch a room I wasn't sure was secure. Not staring, never staring, just noting. He checked his phone 4 times during a television show neither of us was really watching. He left the room twice to take calls he described afterward as just Marcus. He kissed the top of my head on his way to bed and said, "I know this week's been a lot," in a voice that sounded almost like the version of him I'd married. And for one uncomfortable second, I wanted to believe that voice more than I wanted to believe the spreadsheet.
I didn't, but I understood, lying awake next to him that night, why it had taken me 2 years to notice. He was good at this, not because he was a mastermind,
I don't think Alan ever once thought of himself as running an operation, but because he genuinely believed, on some level, that he deserved the benefit of the doubt he'd never once extended to me.
The next morning, before Alan was awake, I drove to Fort Merrow's legal assistance office.
I was a medical retiree, which meant I still had standing to use the base's legal assistance services for personal civil matters, even if actual courtroom representation in a civilian dispute would fall outside what they could do for me directly. Captain Daniel Osei listened to the whole thing without interrupting. The transfers, the storage unit, the HELOC request, the trust my grandfather had set up 17 years earlier.
The trust is the important thing here, he said, pulling up a blank legal pad. If you're the sole trustee and the assets were never commingled with marital property, that trust is likely shielded from anything happening on the Meridian side, and potentially shielded from being used as collateral for a HELOC against a house that trust assets helped secure, depending on how your mortgage was originally structured. I can confirm the trust's basic validity for you today. What I can't do is represent you in a civil fraud matter or a divorce, if it comes to that. That's outside our scope here. But I can get you to someone who handles exactly this. He wrote a name and a number on a card and slid it across the desk. Grace Okafor. She does a lot of work with financial exploitation cases involving veterans and elderly clients. If what you're describing is what it sounds like, she'll know exactly what to do with it.
He's asking me to sign a HELOC application this afternoon, I said. Do I have any grounds to stop that before I've even talked to her?
You have grounds to not sign anything you don't fully understand, which is grounds enough for today. Osei closed his legal pad. I'd also encourage you not to tell him you've spoken to anyone yet. Not because you're doing anything wrong, Mrs. Calloway. You're not. But once he knows you're looking, whatever's really going on gets a lot harder to see clearly. People clean up faster than they build.
I thanked him and drove straight to Grace's office without calling ahead, because some decisions are better made before you give yourself time to talk yourself out of them.
Grace Okafor's office was small, efficient, and smelled like coffee that had been reheated at least once. She read through the printed statements I'd brought, 2 years of them, highlighted, dated, organized the way I used to organize evidence for a briefing, without saying much beyond the occasional that I recognized as the sound of someone doing math in their head.
The trust is clean, she said finally. Your grandfather's attorney did this correctly. You're the sole trustee. The assets have never touched a joint account, and critically, the deed to your house lists the trust as a partial lien holder from a down payment your grandfather contributed before your marriage. That means Alan cannot put your house up as collateral for a HELOC without your trust's sign-off. Full stop. He may not even know that clause exists.
He doesn't, I said. I didn't fully understand it myself until this week.
She kept reading. Then she stopped on one page longer than the others. A form from 2.5 years earlier. A medical liability waiver I'd signed at the hospital the week after the ambush, back when my hand still wasn't steady and a nurse had helped guide the pen.
Do you remember signing this?
Barely. I was on painkillers. Why?
She turned her monitor toward me and pulled up a scan of the notarized HELOC application Alan had submitted that morning to move things along before our meeting. The one with the notary stamp dated for later that same afternoon, but a signature already on file, preloaded into the bank's portal.
Because that's your signature, she said, and it's not from any document you signed for this loan. Look at the pen pressure. Look at the tremor in the N. It's been lifted from somewhere else and reused.
I'm not a document examiner, and I'll want one to confirm this properly before it goes anywhere near a filing, she added. But I've spent 15 years reading signatures on estate paperwork, and I know what a lifted image looks like when I see one.
I looked at the two signatures side by side for a long moment. The one on the hospital waiver, shaky, half-formed, mine from a day I barely remembered. The one on the HELOC application, identical in shape, identical in tremor, appearing on a document I had never in my life laid eyes on.
He's been sitting on a copy of that for 2.5 years, I said, more to myself than to her. Maybe not 2.5, Grace said. Signature lifting like this is usually opportunistic. He needed a clean signature for something recently, remembered this waiver existed in his own hospital paperwork files from when he was your medical proxy, and scanned it. The intent might be newer than the document. That matters for what we can prove, but it doesn't make it better.
It doesn't make it better, I agreed.
She pulled up one more file, the bank's own image authentication log, a technical record most people never think to ask for. This is actually good for you, strange as that sounds. Banks retain metadata on when a signature image was uploaded versus when a document claims to have been physically signed. If that HELOC application was signed this afternoon, but the signature file was uploaded to their portal 3 days ago, that's not just suspicious, that's provable.
Can you get that, TA? I can request it today. Whether they turn it around today is a different question, but we don't need it to stop this afternoon's signing. The trust lien does that on its own, cleanly, without anyone needing to prove intent yet. The signature issue is what turns this from a bad loan into something a prosecutor might eventually care about, if it comes to that. One step at a time.
People don't plan fraud the day they commit it, Grace said. They collect the tools long before they need them. This tells me the storage unit is worth a second look, and it tells me we move today, not next week. She called Homefront Federal Credit Union, the institution that handled my direct VA deposit, to formally flag the account and request their fraud unit review the transfer pattern independently of anything I'd found on my own. That's how the account first reached Priya Desai's desk, hours before I ever sat across from her. Grace also drafted, on the spot, an emergency notice invoking the trust's lien to freeze the HELOC application before it could close, and had it filed electronically with the title company before noon.
Alan called me twice that afternoon. I let both calls go to voicemail. In the second one, his voice had the particular brightness of a man convincing himself something was almost over. The notary's confirmed for 4 o'clock. I really think once this is signed, we can put the rest of this behind us and just move forward. I appreciate you coming around on this, Nora. I know it wasn't easy. I had not come around on anything, but I understood, listening to that message a second time in Grace's parking lot, that Alan believed he'd already won. There was something almost tender in his voice, the sound of a man who thought the hardest thing he'd ever have to survive was already behind him. A sound I recognized because I used to make it myself in a hospital bed, before I understood how long the actual recovery was going to take. He'd stopped bracing for a fight 3 days before it actually arrived, which told me exactly how long he'd been getting away with things nobody questioned.
He sounds relieved, Grace said, glancing at my phone as the message ended. He sounds like a man who thinks the story's already over. Let him think that until 4 o'clock, she said. It's the last afternoon he gets to.
The title company's office was the kind of place designed to make a large transaction feel routine. Beige walls, a coffee station nobody used, a conference table with too many chairs for the number of people in the room. Alan was already there when I arrived, in a blazer he saved for occasions he wanted to look serious for, standing a little too straight next to a notary who was checking her stamp against a checklist.
You made it, he said, and the relief in his voice was almost enough to make me feel something for him. Almost. I made it. He slid the folder toward me. It's straightforward. Sign where it's flagged, initial the 2 disclosure pages, and we're done. I really do think this is the right call, Nora, for both of us. I had the pen in my hand. Grace had told me to let this play out exactly to this point, no further, when my phone rang. Priya Desai's name on the screen, a number I'd saved that morning. I answered it on speaker, deliberately, in a room that had gone very quiet.
Mrs. Calloway, this is Priya Desai from Homefront Federal Credit Union's Fraud Department. I wanted to follow up regarding the pattern we discussed. We've confirmed a recurring transfer originating from your VA disability deposit, redirected through your joint checking account into Meridian Consulting LLC, consistent over a 24-month period. Based on that pattern and additional documentation your attorney provided, we've placed a hold on any further transfers from that account pending a full review. I also want to confirm you received the notice about the lien our records team flagged on the property in question. That lien is currently attached and active, which means it cannot be used as HELOC collateral without the trust's authorization.
Alan's face didn't change all at once. It changed the way weather changes. A shift in the light before you notice the sky is actually different.
Nora, what is she talking about? My phone rang again before I could answer him. Grace, this time, also on speaker. I filed the emergency lien notice with the title company an hour ago. They should have it in the system already. I'd ask them to pull it up before anyone signs anything. The notary, to her credit, was already typing. I have a notice here, she said carefully, filed this morning. There's a hold on this property related to a trust lien.
That's not...
Alan started, then stopped, because there wasn't a version of that sentence that ended anywhere good. Nora, what did you do?
I didn't do anything today, I said. I found out what you'd already done.
The notary looked between us with the practiced neutrality of someone who had clearly sat through worse in this exact room, but not by much. I'm going to need to postpone this signing, she said, already gathering the folder back into a stack. Given the notice on file, I can't proceed.
Alan didn't move for a moment. Then he reached for the folder like he could still salvage it by force of will alone. And I watched something in him settle into a different register entirely. Not panic anymore. Something closer to a man doing arithmetic he didn't want to finish.
You had a lawyer file this without telling me. You had a signature on a HELOC application without telling me it wasn't mine to give.
It's not... He stopped again, ran a hand through his hair, glanced at the notary like she might not be listening. Can we do this somewhere that isn't here?
We can, I said. Grace's office. Now or not at all?
He came. I think, looking back, some part of him understood by then that refusing would only confirm what everyone in that room had already started to believe.
We didn't finish that conversation in the title company's office. Grace met us at her own office an hour later, Alan quieter than I'd heard him in years, the blazer looking less like confidence now and more like a costume he'd put on for a role that had just been canceled.
Grace laid it out without theater, the way you'd read someone their diagnosis. The trust lien meant the house could not be used as HELOC collateral, full stop. That application was dead. The credit union's fraud unit had independently confirmed the transfer pattern from my disability payments into Meridian's operating account, which was itself now under review for how those funds had been used, including payroll records showing a consulting salary paid over 18 months to a name I didn't recognize, Kayla Marsh.
Who is that? I said, though some part of me had already built the shape of the answer before she finished the sentence.
Alan didn't answer. Grace did, reading from a payroll printout. Operations consultant. 18 months on the books. No corresponding deliverables in the client files Marcus provided this afternoon, once he understood what he was being asked to look for.
Grace mentioned the storage unit once more, almost as an aside, paid from the same Meridian account, holding nothing but 2 folding tables and a stack of blank invoice paper. Not evidence of anything specific, just proof of how far Alan had been willing to let the story of inventory run before anyone checked it. Marcus called me himself, 2 hours later, from a number I didn't recognize. His voice had the flat, careful cadence of a man reading from notes he'd written to keep himself from saying something he'd regret.
Grace's office called me at 2 o'clock today and told me there's a fraud investigation touching Meridian's accounts, he said. I want you to know I had my own attorney by 2:30. I built this company with Alan for 6 years, Nora, and I need you to understand I didn't know about any of this. I saw Kayla's name on our payroll, and I assumed she was doing exactly what her title said.
I believe you, I told him. And I did. Marcus had never once been anything but straightforward with me at the handful of dinners and holiday parties I'd sat through over the years, and straightforward people rarely turn out to be the ones running the second set of books.
I've already started the process to formally sever my financial ties to him, Marcus said. Not because I think I'm at legal risk. My attorney says I'm probably clean, since none of this routed through anything I signed off on. But I've got 6 employees whose paychecks depend on this company not being anywhere near whatever Alan's done, and I'm not taking chances with their lives, so I can stay loyal to a business partner who apparently wasn't loyal to either of us.
Kayla Marsh never called me at all. What I got from her, 2 days later, was a 1-line email to Meridian's shared staff account, copied to Marcus, that read, "Effective immediately, I am resigning my position. Please direct final payroll questions to HR." No explanation, no apology. I understood, reading it, that she'd likely known exactly what the family expense reimbursement line meant, even if she hadn't known everything. You don't get paid 18 months for a title with no deliverables without at least suspecting where the money is really coming from. Whether she'd known it was my VA disability payment specifically, I never found out, and Grace told me it likely wouldn't matter much either way. The money trail led back to Alan regardless of how much Kayla had chosen not to ask. I didn't yell at Alan in Grace's office. I didn't cry. I sat with my hands folded on the table the way I used to sit in a debrief, and I let him talk, because a man given room to talk eventually tells you the truth, even when he thinks he's still managing you.
I was going to pay it back, he said, once the company stabilized. I never meant for it to become this.
You forged my signature, Alan. I copied a signature you already gave. I know how that sounds. I'm not saying it was right.
You told me to put my dog down instead of using $9,000 you didn't even know I had access to, while you were sitting on $27,000 of mine you'd already spent.
He didn't have anything to say to that. For the first time since I'd known him, I watched him run out of a version of the story that made him the reasonable one.
The formal consequences took about 6 weeks to fully settle, which Grace told me was fast for this kind of thing. A forensic document examiner Grace brought in that first week confirmed what she'd already suspected. The signature on the HELOC application was a scanned reproduction, not an original. The trust's lien held. The HELOC application was voided, and Alan bore full responsibility for the roughly $85,000 he'd have owed had it gone through, on top of the debts Meridian was already carrying. Close to $140,000 once the creditor freeze forced a full accounting. All of it now legally his alone, separated cleanly from anything under the trust or in my name.
Every credit card that had ever carried both our names, I closed within the first week, in person, at the bank, watching a teller slide each one through a small handheld shredder, while Alan's name disappeared into ribbons on the counter between us. He argued, once, that some of those cards had debt on them that wasn't only his doing. Grace's response, when I related to her, was one sentence. Then he can show the court which charges were yours. He never produced that list. I don't think it existed. My VA disability record was corrected and flagged internally so that no joint account would ever again be listed as a default deposit destination without a second authorization. A small, quiet fix that took 4 phone calls and meant more to me than almost anything else in that 6-week stretch, because it was the one part of this that had nothing to do with Alan at all. It was just the government finally agreeing that the money was mine. The credit union closed its investigation with a formal finding of unauthorized diversion of protected federal benefit payments, a finding Grace said would matter considerably in the divorce filing that followed, since it established on the record exactly whose money had funded exactly what. Alan's older brother, Thomas, called me once, about a month into all of it. I expected a defense of some kind, the family closing ranks the way families sometimes do, out of habit more than conviction. Instead, his voice was tight and careful, like he'd practiced the call in his car before dialing.
Alan told me his version of it, he said, that you're punishing him, that you're being vindictive about a business decision that went bad.
That's one way to describe forging my signature.
Silence on the line, long enough that I almost thought he'd hung up. I called the credit union myself, Thomas finally said, told them I was his brother, asked if there was any way what he told me could be true instead of what you're saying. They obviously couldn't tell me anything specific, but the woman on the phone had a tone, Nora. You learn to hear a tone. I need you to know I didn't know any of this, and I need you to know I'm done pretending I don't, now that I do.
He hasn't spoken to Alan since, as far as I know. I didn't ask him to make that choice. He made it because a man forging his own wife's signature of a hospital waiver isn't a thing you can unknow once someone says it out loud on a phone call you placed yourself to check.
I filed for divorce in the same month the trust lien held. Grace's paralegal walked me through the paperwork at a small round table with a box of tissues nobody used, and it struck me, signing my name for what felt like the 100th time that year, how different this signature felt from the one Alan had lifted off a hospital form. How much steadier my hand was now than it had been the day a nurse guided it across a liability waiver I couldn't fully read. There was very little to divide in the end, because there was very little that had ever actually been ours in the legal sense. My grandfather had made sure of that 17 years before either Alan or I knew the other existed. On a summer afternoon at a kitchen table I still remember more clearly than I remember most of the last 2 years of my marriage. The last time I saw Alan in person was the day I came back for the rest of my things, a Saturday in early spring, movers waiting in the driveway with the truck running. He was sitting on the porch steps when I pulled up, like he'd been waiting there specifically to catch me before I could avoid him. "I keep thinking about the parking lot call," he said, before I'd even gotten out of the car, "about the dog. If I could take one thing back, it would be that. Not the money, not the signature. The dog." I know how that sounds. It sounds honest, actually. I said, which is more than I got out of you for 2 years.
He didn't have anything to say to that. I went inside, packed the last 2 boxes I'd left behind, and Duke waited in the car with the window cracked, watching the house through the glass without much interest, the way you watch a place that has already stopped meaning anything to you. Alan stayed on the porch the whole time. He didn't offer to help carry anything, and I didn't ask him to.
Duke is 8 months out from his surgery now. He still favors his left side a little when it's cold, but he runs the fence line every morning like nothing ever happened to him. And some mornings I stand at the back door with coffee I haven't touched yet and just watch him do it.
I moved into a smaller house that spring, one the trust helped me buy outright. No mortgage, no name on the deed but mine. Denise drove up from Charlotte to help me unpack, and somewhere around the 3rd box of kitchen things, she held up an old photo of Alan and me from a Christmas years back, and just looked at me, not saying anything, waiting to see what I wanted done with it. I told her to put it in the donation box with the frame still on it. It felt less like erasing something, and more like finally being honest about what it had actually been worth.
I kept his old collar, the one from his working days, worn soft at the buckle, even after I bought him a new one. It used to sit in a drawer as a reminder of the day he pulled me out of a burning vehicle. It sits on my desk now, next to the folder Grace helped me build. And somewhere in the last several months, its meaning shifted, without me really deciding it should. It isn't a reminder of what almost killed me anymore. It's a reminder that I still know how to notice when something doesn't add up, that the training never left. It had just been sitting quietly in a drawer of its own, waiting for me to trust it again. I still think about Priya Desai, going quiet over her monitor that first morning, scrolling back up to the same 2-year window, like it might resolve into something less true if she looked again. I've thought about how strange it is that a stranger noticed the shape of my own life in a spreadsheet before I let myself finish noticing it in my own kitchen. She wasn't the reason any of this came apart. I was. But she was the first person outside my own head to say the number out loud, and there's a particular relief in hearing someone else confirm a thing you already suspected, but hadn't yet let yourself believe. I think a lot of people confuse being taken care of with being controlled. I did for 2 years. Letting someone carry your bills when you're recovering from an injury isn't weakness, but there's a difference between someone carrying a weight for you and someone deciding, quietly, that the weight is now theirs to spend. I didn't need Alan to protect me from stress. I needed him to be honest with me. Those aren't the same thing, even though for a long time I let myself believe they were.
If any part of this sounds familiar, if you've handed someone your accounts, your paperwork, your peace of mind, because it was easier than asking questions you were afraid of the answers to, I'd ask you to do one thing this week. Look at a statement. Just one. You don't have to accuse anyone of anything. You just have to know what's true. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who needs the reminder that being cared for and being controlled can look identical from the outside, and that you're allowed to check the difference for yourself.